Sorry. Get all the technical stuff set up.
I got it from here. It just wasn't plugged in. I couldn't figure out why it's not working.
Just pray real briefly. Father, we thank you for the opportunity to stand before you and worship you. And just ask during this next time that you would communicate everything that you desire to communicate to us, whether it be understanding or just mere information, but most of all, Father, we ask that you would communicate and impart your heart into us, that we could be your ambassadors in these days. We thank you for these things in Jesus' name. So, okay, it's 10:30, and I should be done by what time, realistically? What's that? What'd you say, 11:30? 12:30. Okay. So we sort of have two things that we're going to do. One is a little bit of a teaching, which is probably slightly unconventional for a Sunday morning, but I think in your case, you guys are used to slightly unconventional. I don't think you guys always just get a flowery Sunday sermon, right? You guys get into the meat. So we're going to do that, and then Zach and some of the brothers had asked if I could share a bit about the recent trip to Iraq that I went with a handful of brothers, and just sort of give you an update on what we experienced and saw and what the purpose of that was. So sort of two different things here. So the title of the first session, this session that we're going to dig into, I'm going to try to work through, try to get through the pertinent information and skip through some of it, is Prophetical Evangelism in the book of Daniel. So the purpose of this title is, where this finds its genesis is, so many of you know Brother Reggie Kelly and his history with our cats. So they had a class, was it a class or course called Apocalyptic Evangelism, and really there's no difference here in terms of what I'm talking about. I just changed the word to prophetical because I'm overly sensitive to being branded, apocalyptic, or how people perceive that as just, comets and meteors and volcanoes and things, and so the purpose of this term is to say that as we approach the days ahead, the church will have the profound opportunity, unlike any previous generations, or unlike few previous generations, to begin to point to the words of the prophets, the biblical prophets, as we are declaring the gospel and the validity of the Word of God and all of these things, and to point out into the earth and say, this is that. And so as we're seeking to convince a lost and dying world of the challenge of their Creator on their lives, we will have the opportunity to begin to point to the things that the prophets spoke of clearly, and then point out into the earth and say, this is being fulfilled. And when we look at the lives of the words of the ministry of the apostles, yes, they had power evangelism. They would cast out devils, they would have power encounters, heal the sick, and this sort of thing. And that was a profound apologetic to their message. That was backing up their message. But when it came to their arguments and so forth, it was so frequently, it was overwhelmingly turning to the words of the prophets and of the scriptures to prove to the people that Jesus was in fact the Messiah, that this man is in fact that was spoken of. But throughout much of history, there wasn't much to point into the earth and say, this is that. You could point to the dispersal of the Jews among the nations, and you could point to history, but we're entering a season. It's soon will be upon us when we'll be able to point to events in the earth and then relate that to things spoken of in the prophets. Now, when I was here last year, we took a session, and Reggie and I sort of worked through Daniel 11. So this is a chapter that I had held to what was perhaps a little bit more of a traditional perspective And if you're familiar with Daniel 11, it's a profoundly involved and detailed, complicated prophecy. It's probably the most detail-filled prophecy that we have in terms of just a lot of specifics. But what most people do is when they get to this chapter, they bring it pretty close to the end, and they say everything previous to that is historical, and then suddenly it takes a shift at verse 35 and 36, and they say now it's talking about the Antichrist. But in verse 21 through 35, they say this is the historical, the 8th king of the Seleucid dynasty, Antiochus Epiphanes. And, Reggie had a few years back, I'm not sure when the first time that we really had to, and this was the thing, he said, brother, the thing that I really want to communicate is the futurity of at least beginning with verse 21 through, and I kind of entertained that, slowly until finally it just forced itself upon me that there's no way you can get around the fact that from at least verse 21 through the very end of the prophecy, it's giving us incredible specific details about the Antichrist. But the transition does not begin with verse 35, begin with verse 36, but it begins at least back with verse 21. And so this was a significant flip for me in terms of how radically futuristic some of the prophecies in the book of Daniel are. And then I've been wrestling probably for the past couple of years with Daniel 8. And so what I want to do now is work through Daniel 8. Again, we're just sort of doing it fairly briefly. And what I'm presenting, I'm not dogmatic, I'm not, saying this is that, but I want to present a slightly more futuristic interpretation of this. And since we have Reggie here, I get the chance to kind of lay it out at least a little bit, and then he can chew on it and throw back a response, in some time. But this is just sort of presenting it to the body for people to peer into this prophecy, to look out at the earth, and to say maybe this slightly different, less than traditional interpretation could be valid. And if it is, then this, like Daniel chapter 11, will be one of the most profound chapters that the church will be able to turn to and to say this is that, perhaps. So we begin in verse 1, Daniel chapter 8, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel. It's subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. So he's speaking of Daniel chapter 7, the vision of the 4 beasts. He says, this one came after. And I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa. Susa is in southwest modern-day Iran. Okay, this would have been, the region of modern-day Iran. He says, which is in the province of Elam. That was the southwestern province of Persia, whereas Daniel was in Babylon. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. So scholars debate among themselves, but most tend to agree that he was there in vision. He was not there physically. He was not there and just happened to have a vision while he was there. The Lord took him there in a visionary experience. So this is a map showing where Shushan is in relation to modern-day nations today. The city is called Shush, Shush, which is which it would be nice if that's all I said to my kids, Shush, but unfortunately it frequently extends far beyond Shush. Verse 3, behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. So now you have, there's a picture, the ram with 2 horns. Now, 2 horns were long. One was longer than the other. So it's a ram with 2 horns. One's longer than the other. The longer one comes up last. Verse 4, the ram is budding westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power, but he did as he pleased, and he magnified himself. So the ram coming from the region of modern-day Iran, ancient Persia, is budding out westward into what would be the modern-day Middle East, as well as northward and southward, and no one could rescue. He did as he pleased. He magnified himself. Then you have verse 5. While I was observing, behold, the male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. So I always just say this so that everyone will remember it. It's a super goat. You know, he leaps over the whole earth without touching the ground. And he had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. You could say a prominent, a singular horn. So it is a super unicorn goat. So you'll always remember the super unicorn goat leaps from the west across the earth. Verse 6, he came up to the ram that had 2 horns, which I saw stand in front of the canal, and he rushed at him with mighty wrath. So he's enraged. Now overwhelmingly, the commentary scholars, commentators are going to say this prominent horn is Alexander the Great, who lived from 356 to 323 BC. Just this profound military leader of the Alexandrian, the Greek Empire, that swept out of Macedonia, the region of modern day, the Balkans, Greece and Bulgaria, and Albania, and these nations, and it swept across modern day Turkey and all the way across the Middle East to modern day Iran, and it just crushed them all in a profound series of military victories. Verse 7, so I saw him come beside the ram. He was enraged at him. He struck the ram. He shattered his 2 horns. The ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground. He trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. So, loosely, just again looking at modern geographic boundaries, you've got the ram coming from the region of modern day Iran. The goat is coming from the region of, as we'll see, it's the term in Hebrew is Yavan. Now, it's often translated as Greece, and it included modern-day Greece, but don't limit yourself to the modern nation of Greece. Yavan was the region that spanned the Aegean Sea, both on the west coast of the Balkans, the east coast of the Balkans there, again, Greece, Bulgaria, Albania, as well as the southwestern coast of modern-day Turkey. So on both sides, that was Yavan. And then later, after Alexander conquered the whole Middle East, the greater area of Greece was referred to as Yavan. So the word sort of develops a bit, evolves as the Bible moves forward in history. And so here's a map that Alexander conquered. So, he came from Macedonia there in the purple. He swept across the whole Middle East, and it was just a massive, massive empire that he succeeded in conquering in just a few years. And then it says, then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. Again, speaking of the Greek Empire and Alexander, but it says, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn, the singular horn, was broken. And in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And I threw in a picture. I didn't know that there's actually such thing as a goat that has 4 horns. You never know what you might find when you start Googling. But I always thought that would be a great skull to put on the front of the garage. People put the deer skulls to be like, what kind of beast is that? With a goat with 4 horns. So someday I'll get one. I don't know where they come from. Verse 9. Out of one of them came. So now you've got 4 horns come in place of the one. But out of one of them comes a small horn, which grew exceedingly great, specifically toward the south. So it grows toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land, which would, of course, be the Holy Land, the promised land of Israel. Now, again, overwhelmingly, most commentators will say this little horn was the 8th king of the Seleucid or Seleucid dynasty, Antiochus Epiphanes. And, of course, his exploits feature profoundly in the history of the Jewish nation, as he eventually became one of the greatest antagonists to the people of Israel. And in fact, he's clearly the greatest type of the Antichrist in all of Scripture, the things that he did in Jerusalem just a couple hundred years before Jesus. And then in verse 10 it says, the little horn, it grew up to the host of heaven, and it caused some of the host and the stars to fall to the earth. It trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal to the commander of the host. It removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice. and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. So now this is where most commentators that are futurists, that believe that prophecy does often revolve around the day of the Lord, the return of Jesus, and the events that surround the return of Jesus. This is where they say, these things are things that Antiochus did not accomplish. He did not cause the stars of heaven to fall down. Speaking of angels, this is not something he did. This is now speaking of the Antichrist, even Satan himself. This is something far greater than just the historical 8th king of the Seleucid dynasty. So what most commentators, again, who are not liberal, who are believers, who actually believe that these things are prophetic, but then who are futurists, again, who have that day of the Lord, return of Jesus focus, most often how the vision is interpreted. Because the vision that Daniel received is verses 3 through 12. That's where the vision itself is contained. Then we're going to step into the interpretation by the angel Gabriel. The way they do it is they break it up. They say verses 3 through 8, the portion of the vision that speaks of the ram, the two-horned ram, the super goat, the 4 horns, they say that's historical. That part was all fulfilled perfectly in history. And then they say, but in verses 9 through 12, when we get to the little horn, and I don't really like the term dual fulfillment, but they'll say, well, it sort of has dual fulfillment. It was fulfilled. They'll either say it was in the life of Antiochus as a type, with its ultimate fulfillment being in the future with Antichrist, or some others will say it was fulfilled in Antiochus, but in that we can see shadows of Antichrist. I always led toward the idea that Antiochus was a type, and Antichrist is clearly the ultimate fulfillment. This was always my position. Now I want to just present to you again, to submit to you the possibility and a brief case for what I call the consistent futurist interpretation. And what I mean by that is simply this, is that in verses 3 all the way through 12, whether we're speaking of the ram, the goat, the 4 horns, or the little horn, all of it, yes, we had profound it was fulfilled historically in types. The events of the breakout of the Medo-Persian Empire, the response by Alexander the Great, all of these things were types, but that the entire vision, from the very beginning of the vision to the end, all has eschatological, ultimate future application. And again, I'm not being dogmatic about this, but I think it's something that we need to look at. So first of all, the first argument is that, we begin with arguing that Antiochus, verses 9 through 12, clearly could not be fulfilled in history. And so clearly Antiochus did not cause the stars or the angels to be removed from heaven. That this event of him growing up to the host of heaven is something that cannot be said of Antiochus. The term, the host of heaven, or the stars of heaven, are never used of humans in the Bible, never. Now, a few verses later where it says the host will be given over to it, as well as the sacrifice, the offerings, the temple, you can argue that those are the rulers of Israel. The host, if you just say host, when you say the host of heaven and the stars of heaven, all biblical precedent is going to point us to these being angels, angelic beings, and that what's being spoken of here is a profound eschatological event that takes place in the at the beginning of the final 3.5 years, whereas Satan and his angels are cast, the accuser of our brethren is cast down out of heaven. And so for brief biblical precedent, Job 38, you've got angels being referred to as the morning stars, the sons of God here. Who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Scholars will say, well, sometimes people are referred to as stars. They'll say, Abraham, the Lord took him out and said, look at the stars, so shall your descendants be. But again, all the Lord's saying there is, just look at the stars. They're numerous. So will your descendants be. He's not saying your descendants will be stars. And then later in Daniel 11 and 12, it says those who have understanding will shine like the stars. But they won't actually become stars. They're not actually called stars. And so there's a handful of other passages you can look at. But then the primary one, is Revelation 12. I've just got 3 through 4, then verse 9. And this whole prophecy is built on this passage in Daniel 8. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon. This is Satan, 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads are 7 crowns. And his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven, and he threw them to the earth. The great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, is called devil, or the Satan. He deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. This is an event that is yet to take place. It has not taken place yet. It will dramatically change things. We don't have time to get into the details of all that that entails. And then there's this declaration, now the salvation, the power, the kingdom of our God, the authority of his Messiah has come, for the accuser of our brethren has been cast down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. For this reason rejoice, O you heavens, and all you who dwell in the earth. On the other hand, woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he only has a short time. For this very brief period, just before the return of Christ, Satan and his angels, the accuser, will be cast out of the heavenly realms. And it will be profound persecution on the earth, but it will change things profoundly in the spirit, in terms of our ability to relate to the Father. So first of all, Antiochus did not fulfill that element of the vision. Secondly, this is a biggie, is that when Gabriel begins telling Daniel, interpreting the vision for Daniel, he tells us very clearly the timing, the context of the vision. So verse 15 through 16, after I had seen the vision, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, standing before me was one, he looked like a man. I heard a voice from a man who was between the banks of the canal, the Ulai Canal, and he called out, he says, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. Wouldn't you just so yearn to hear that? You know, Gabriel's in the room. Explain to this man the vision. Verse 17, so he came near to me where I was standing. When he came, I was frightened. I fell on my face, and he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. You know, he just makes a very clear statement. Son of man, listen to me. Understand the vision pertains to the time of the end. Verse 18, now while he was talking to me, I sank into a deep sleep. You know, he's in a vision, and he has a vision of sinking into, you know, I don't know, it's like, I was dreaming that I was sleeping, or, you know, it's just these weird things. But in his vision, he goes into a deep sleep, and then he touches me, and he makes me stand upright. And he says, behold, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of indignation. This is a very specific phrase. Throughout the history of the Jewish people, you have multiple periods of the Lord pouring out his indignation. This is the final period of indignation. Later in Daniel 11, it refers to the final period of indignation and to the context of the career of the Antichrist. And then again he says, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. 3 times in 2 sentences, the first thing that Gabriel says is the vision pertains to the time of the end, the final period of indignation, the appointed time of the end. Now the first point, just, you know, again, that we have to consider. I'm not saying it's not possible, but he did not say, Daniel, let me explain it to you. Verses 3 through 8 pertain to his history, but verses 9 through 12 pertain to the time of the end. He just said, Daniel, the vision concerns the time of the end. So we need to at least ponder the possibility that the entirety of the vision pertains to the time of the end. Without diminishing the profound events that took place in history, without denying that they in many ways lined up, acknowledging the places where they didn't. So there it is in Daniel 11. Verse 36, the Antichrist, he says monstrous things against the God of gods, etc. And he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. That's the final period of indignation. So then he begins to explain in detail, and Gabriel says, the ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Yavon in Hebrew, the king translated as Greece. The large horn between his eyes is the first king. Now, pretty much what every commentator does is they get to this verse and they say, that settles it. It uses the historical names, Medo, Persia, and Greece. Therefore, it's talking about the primary meaning of the vision is historical, Media, and Persia. The problem with that is that the reasoning, that same reasoning, is not applied anywhere else when we have eschatological prophecies. You know, if you go to, you can go to any number. You go to Ezekiel 38:39, probably the biggie. Everyone agrees up front that it's an eschatological prophecy, but the names that it uses, you know, Meshach, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah, Magog, all of these, I mean, these go back to Genesis 10 in the Table of Nations. But no one says, well, because he's using historical names, this must be just fulfilled in history. Instead, they say, no, Ezekiel was using the names that he would have understood, and his audience would have understood in his day, to point to regions that we could locate on the map that would correlate to modern-day nations and regions in the end times, because the prophecy is eschatological. Joel 3, a day of the Lord prophecy. He says, woe to you, all you of Philistia. It's not talking about the ancient Philistines. Philistia is basically the region of modern-day Gaza. Woe to you, Tyre and Sidon. You know, that's still the same in modern-day Lebanon. But, you know, he's almost basically saying Hezbollah, Hamas. And so we look at the prophecies where they use the ancient names, and if we understand it to be an eschatological prophecy, then we understand that he's pointing to regions that we could understand in our day. Really probably, you know, the best term that in Daniel's time they would have used for the region of Asia Minor, Turkey, or possibly the Balkans, that western area, would have been Yavon. You know, it's not like they're going to suddenly throw out words like Turkey so that we would not understand it until, you know, suddenly there's a Turkey. Now, what's interesting is that, you know, and I wrestle with prophecy in terms of how do we understand it. Can prophecies be fulfilled multiple times, or are they just simply fulfilled in types with one primary ultimate fulfillment? And that's where I lean, although clearly events in history they can shadow the ultimate that's to come. And when you just look at history, and you know, this goes deeper than just geography and so forth. It goes back to this issue of the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece, you know, the Prince of Yavon. That there's a spiritual conflict, and I think that ties into geography, you know, the same way that Turkey, you know, Asia Minor, it's a profoundly strategically located piece of property. You know, it's always going to be a bridge, both culturally and in terms of travel, in terms of energy pipelines, and I mean, in so many ways, it's a geographically, strategically beneficial piece of property. The United States and Canada, you know, we've got open access on both sides to the Atlantic, the Pacific, and no matter what, you know, that's not going to change. 2,000 years ago, you know, people from these regions had benefits, of course, you know, once they became an established entity. They had benefits that other parts of the world don't have. Russia has very limited access to the ocean. If they have to work their way down, you know, through some of the, you know, past Norway and then down through Turkey. They don't just have open, free access, or China on the other side like we do. But when you look at the region, it's interesting that in ancient history you had Medo-Persia that was then clashing with Greece. You know, these two parts of the world throughout history, they're just constantly clashing. And then stepping forward a little bit, you had Rome that was clashing with Parthia. And Rome, you know, very few people talk about Parthia, the Persian Empire. Rome was never able to defeat. They would make little inroads and then get beaten back, usually roughly somewhere along the line of the Euphrates. Then later you had the Byzantine Empire, the remnant of the Roman Empire, clashing with the Sassanids. Then for so long you had the Ottomans clashing with the Safavids. And today, in so many ways, you have Turkey and Iran that are contending these two alpha dogs contending for leadership over the region. Iran, with their Iranian Revolution, wants to control the Middle East. Turkey wants to sort of revive Ottoman control of the Middle East that they had for 500 years. And you just see history repeating itself in these same parts of the world so many times. And again, there's that spiritual principle that I don't fully understand, of the principalities of the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece. Number 3, Alexander's empire, and this is a big one, did not break up into 4. And this is a big one that I'm finding that I really need to, I'm digging hard into the history books. I've been, collecting with some of the digital stuff. I got about 150 commentaries on Daniel, and of course so many of them are liberal, so they're almost worthless, but there's a lot of good ones in there and some great nuggets, and just trying to go through all of the different commentaries, and I'm amazed at how overwhelmingly the guys that are conservative futurists, they'll say clearly this fulfills, because Alexander's empire immediately broke up into 4 with his 4 generals, or they'll say 25 years or so later it broke up into 4, and Alexander's 4 generals divided up his empire. But when you look at the history of what happened after Alexander died, it simply is not true. It did not break up into 4. In fact, there is no period, the next 50 years after Alexander died, that you can say it clearly was divided into 4. It never happened. Certainly not in a clear way. So, coming from verse 22, the broken horn, Gabriel's explaining, and the 4 horns that arose in its place represent 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. He's very clear that 4 distinct kingdoms will arise in his place, not with his full power. This is a quote from John Walvoord, former dean of Dallas Theological Seminary, and this is indicative of the type of comments that you'll get. He says, practically all commentators recognize the 4 horns as symbolic of the 4 kingdoms of the Diadochi. That just means the successors, which emerged as follows. He lists Cassander. He lists the regions that he controlled. Lysimachus, or Lysimachus, took control of Thrace, Bithynia. How do you say it?
Lysimachus.
Lysimachus, okay. Yeah, I was talking on the way over how I'm infamous for mispronouncing things. Is it, would you say Seleucus or Seleucus? Seleucus, okay. I always used to say Seleucus, and then someone corrected me and said, it's Seleucus. And so then I changed it for probably a year or 2, and then someone came up and said, it's Seleucus. So I'm just like schizophrenic. But I think it is Seleucus. So then he lists Seleucus took Syria and the lands to the east of Babylonia, and then Ptolemy established rule over Egypt. So these are the 4 that if you read most conservative modern commentators, they'll all list. Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. And he says practically all commentators agree on this. The problem is that's not true. They don't. And in fact, when you look at the history of what unfolded, in no way is it clear, and it's evidenced by the fact that commentators can't agree. They all as Christians want to validate, they feel obligated to say, well, the Bible's true, because they feel as though this is speaking historically, and they must argue that it took place that way. But I just threw out a few other opinions. So Hippolytus in 305, early church writer, one of the primary guys in the early days that spoke a lot about wrote a lot about the end times. He lists Seleucus, Demetrius, Ptolemy, and Philip. And then about 50 years later, I don't think I listed, there's another guy that agreed with Hippolytus. In 355, Eusebius, the church historian, he listed Ptolemy, Philip, Seleucus, and instead of Demetrius, he had Antigonus, which was Demetrius' dad. Antigonus was the greatest of all the successors. They call him Antigonus the One-Eyed, because I guess he was blind in one eye. And I forget how it translates into Greek, but it sounds really cool, because it's almost like the Cyclops general, And he was in his 80s, and he ran circles around all these young guys militarily, and he had been around for a long time. And then in 407, Jerome followed Eusebius' list, and then in 430, Theodoret of Cyrus listed Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, but instead of Philip, he included, I don't know how you say that, Antipater? Antipater. And so the point is, even from the early days, they're all like, clearly this refers to the four, but they can't even agree on which four. And the reason is because when you really look at the history, it is not clear at all. And I'm not going to go through all of the history of what happened because there was just a series of wars. But, you know, because I want to be faithful in this, I've just, you know, got a stack of just secular historical works on what happened after Alexander died, and so far, you know, so far none of them point to four. So basically, after Alexander died, you had a guy named Perdiccas, that Alexander gave him his ring, and he called everyone to Babylon, and all of the generals and different people, and he was sort of supposed to be the regent, the temporary ruler, until they could decide on what to do. And so you had Perdiccas, and then you had another general, Meleager, who was a pretty prominent guy. And what they, after this meeting, they decided these two guys would be the co-regents until Alexander's wife Roxana was pregnant. And they said if she has a boy, he'll be the future king, along with Philip, who was Alexander's brother, but something was wrong with him. He was mentally deficient, and so he was more of just sort of a figurehead. And so they said Meleager and Perdiccas would be the co-regents temporarily until these other two kings could be the co-kings, which is kind of goofy. But very quickly, you know, intrigue, and Perdiccas had Meleager assassinated. And so now it was Perdiccas. And so pretty much right away he broke up the Alexander's empire into 26 different provinces, satrapies. And so here's just a loose map of all the different provinces initially. So you begin with, if you want to be technical, you could say 2 horns and then 1, or 26, you know, and this is, you know, in the years immediately. And then we're moving forward 20 years now after Alexander died. A series of wars, the first wars of the Diadochi, the second war of the Diadochi. This is the point where most commentators say, finally we reach the point where there's only 4. But really, in 303, you had the fivefold division. Antigonus had most of Asia Minor, or Turkey. Seleucus had most of the eastern regions, the eastern satraps. Then you had Lysimachus and Cassander up in, again, the Balkans, Ptolemy down in Egypt. And actually, this map is a slight oversimplification because there were a handful of other smaller regions. And then in 301, you had what was called the Battle of Ipsus, where Seleucus defeated Antigonus, finally. And that's where everyone says, now there's 4, roughly 20 some odd years after Alexander. The problem is that Antigonus' son Demetrius, although Seleucus defeated Antigonus, Demetrius then took a few regions, and he still had his region. So you could say Antigonus' control was passed to his son. It was changed and diminished, but he still had some large holdings, and there were still a handful of others. And so by this point of 301, where a lot of people try to say it was down to 4, it's not true. It was down to several. And by that point, there were really 2 primary horns, if you will. There was Seleucus and Ptolemy. And then the other guys had some smaller land holdings. And eventually Ptolemy in Egypt and Seleucus in the north became the primary divisions or dynasties that were contending. And there were a handful of others. But there were always several others. And so either we're forced to one, say, well, we don't need to be that specific. When Gabriel said there will be 4 kingdoms, he was just sort of speaking loosely. And when we look elsewhere in Daniel 11, it says the kingdom was broken up toward the 4 winds of heaven. You could say, toward the 4 points of the compass. You could say he's just being general. Like, I'm okay with that there in Daniel 11. But in Daniel 8, he's pretty clear. 4 horns come up in his place. And we're either forced to say, well, it didn't really mean 4. It's just being vague. And even if we say it's 4, we can't even agree on which 4. Or we're forced to conclude that history simply did not perfectly fulfill the prophecy. And in this case, I'm convinced that when the prophecy is fulfilled, in the ultimate sense, it will be fulfilled precisely. And the events that are fulfilled as types They come close to fulfilling it, but they fall short. And the Lord allowed that to happen so that we can see the pattern, we can see the shadow, we can see the type, but knowing that something greater is yet to come. And so that's my thesis at this point. We could move on. Antiochus did not emerge in the latter period of the Diadochi, the successors. Verse 23, it says, in the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent, skilled in intrigue. So the little horn would have to, if it's Antiochus, it has to emerge in the latter period of the rule of these successors. The problem is, if you look at the totality of the Seleucid Empire, Antiochus emerged almost right in the middle. Before his reign, you had 130 years, and there were 7 kings. He was the 8th. After his reign, after he died, you had 100 years and 22 kings. So his reign began slightly left of the center of the reign of the Diadochi, if you will. And so it's very hard to say in the latter period unless you go, well, it's slightly, slightly right of center, and that's the latter period. But again, it forces us to say the scriptures are just being vague. Whereas I believe that when they're fulfilled, they're not vague at all. They're profoundly precise most often. Antiochus did not expand to the east. This is a biggie. Out of one of them comes forth a small horn, which grew exceedingly toward the south, toward the east, toward the beautiful land. Antiochus already controlled the Seleucid dynasty. He never pushed east. If anything, he was pushing the other way. He was pushing south and toward Israel. So it's just another reason why Antiochus does not align it. Antiochus did not oppose the Prince of Princes, if we interpret that as Jesus, or even, the commander of the host. You can't say that of Antiochus. So here's the implications. If, in fact, the consistent futurist interpretation is correct, then in the same way that Daniel 11 becomes one of the most, if not the most profound, detailed roadmaps for the final 7 years that tells us in incredible details about the career of the Antichrist, if the consistent futurist interpretation of Daniel 8 is correct, then so also does Daniel 8 become one of these texts that will give us a roadmap leading up to the career of the Antichrist, that we'll be able to point to an unfolding series of events and point to people. We're not there yet, but we'll be able to point to the unbelievers and to the believers and say, this is that. Watch it unfold. And when we begin to watch prophecy unfold according to his program. And so if it's correct, we would expect to see probably Iran, the two-horned ram. Well, you say, well, how does that work? Medo-Persia, which controls the region of ancient Medo-Persia. How does that work? Well, basically, you'd say the horns represent 2 rulers, it says 2 kings, and it fits. Iran has the Ayatollah, and then it has the president. It's really a co-ruled, the Ayatollah would be prominent. He didn't come up last, unless you could say unless you're looking at the history of Iran, and you say, well, they always had a president. Then the office of the Ayatollah came up later. You could say that. It's a little bit tricky. Sir, I'm going to need you. Just kidding with you. And then on the other hand, after Iran breaks out in a regional, Middle Eastern attack, sometime down the road, whether it could be a short time or it could be a few years, Turkey responds with and it could be Turkey or it could be a Turkish coalition. I would expect Turkey. And again, that's sort of just based on looking at events, looking at the geostrategic, landscape of the region. I would expect Turkey, but it could be something a little bit more European. Responds and crushes Iran. And then establishes, if you will, sort of a greater Turkey. And then at the height of this new expanded territory, the prominent horn, whoever the leader of Turkey is at that time, is broken off. And it breaks up into 4, and then out of one of these 4 comes Antichrist. That would be the loose implications. Now, when we look at what's unfolding right now in the Middle East, it makes profound sense that this could be something that we could see in the near future. You look at the nation of Iran today, they already control the whole southern area of Iraq. From Baghdad to that whole southern area below the red of ISIS, that's all Shia majority. And pretty much the government there is just a proxy, a puppet of Iran. In Syria, Bashar Assad, the former president, and still the president of Syria, it's just a much smaller area that he controls, he's a puppet of Iran. In Lebanon, Hezbollah, this is a proxy, a puppet of Iran. Iran is already, its fingers, its tentacles are already throughout the Middle East. And now they got the Houthi rebels on the southern border of Saudi Arabia. They've fomented that rebellion. And Iran's, this is the way they always work, through proxies. Israel, has this missile strike. They take out one of the most prominent Iranian generals, and he's right on the border of Israel. I don't know if he's in Syria or Lebanon, just a couple months ago. And so Iran is already there, but I think the prophecy is speaking of a clear military breakout, much more than even just through proxies. There is a budding out into the region. And I think that with ISIS now having swept through, which are Sunni, Iran is Shia, the minority sect, the 12 to 15% sect, the ISIS are the radical Sunnis. In so many ways, this is the perfect bait to lure them out. And when war and all these things are breaking out in the region, it gives excuses to well, we need to draw military out, for the sake of the people, for the sake of peace. There's always excuses when there's already war breaking out throughout the region, and as ISIS is encroaching on some of the Shia sacred cities in Iraq. Just in so many ways it makes sense. Now, ISIS, we need to understand, ISIS is Turkey's junkyard dog. It's their proxy. It's their bad boy that they're using. In the same way that Iran uses Hezbollah and some of these other entities, Turkey is giving. ISIS is the ideological child of Saudi Arabia. That radical Sunni crazy Al-Qaeda, that came out of Saudi Arabia. But logistically, financially, practically, in terms of weapons, in so many ways, it is the proxy of Turkey. Turkey is allowing ISIS to take place. They are allowing all these young men to flow into Istanbul, down through Antioch, into Syria by the tens of thousands. And then, they'll arrest like 3 and be like, we're opposed to ISIS. There's just so much evidence. And in the intelligence community, some of the guys that I talked to, it's not even a secret that Turkey is allowing and supporting ISIS. You've got a video of the Turkish soldiers pulling up to the border, getting out, waving to the guys in ISIS. They come over and start talking, shake hands, chat for a while. Okay, they've got it. They've got, there's no conflict there. They allow the young men to flow in, and they're doing that for their regional purposes in their war against Bashar Assad. They're using ISIS in their war against Assad, in their war against the Kurds in the north. So the Kurds would kind of span the region from Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, all above ISIS. The Turks don't like the Kurds because they want their own country, and in their proxy war against Iran. So there is already a war taking place, but it's a quiet proxy war. If this thing turns into a full-blown war, if Iran invades the Middle East, I'll be pretty close to saying this is probably that. And if we see Turkey respond and crush Iran, then I will definitely be at the place to say, this is that. Watch it break into 4, and watch the Antichrist emerge out of one of the 4. Again, we need to be so careful when it comes to prophetical evangelism. We need to be so cautious of jumping the gun and saying, this is that, and then it's not that, and then you just have done damage to this greatest tool in our arsenal. Do you know what I'm saying? This will be, when Israel became a nation, this is one of the primary underlying reasons for the Jesus movement. This is why so many people were swept into the kingdom, because the fulfillment of prophecy is unarguable, but we need to be careful and responsible with it. So, I just want to be clear, I'm presenting this to the church not as dogmatic, not as saying this is that, but could this be? Could this be what the Lord was indicating? And we need to watch in the days ahead. And I mean, this could be right around the corner, or it could be quite a ways down the road. So that's that. Now, to transition into the trip to northern Iraq, I'll say this. So, I mean, when was I here last year? What month was it? It was March, because it was still cold, yeah. Everyone was like, man, it's really warmed up. It's like 0. You got here at a good time of year. But, so it was June when ISIS swept out of Syria and just kind of blitzkrieg the whole, just shocked everybody, and swept across the Middle East. And as Obama said, the junior varsity team that we shouldn't really be worried, they're just Al-Qaeda junior varsity team, suddenly just shook the world. Somebody made the sarcastic but quite accurate comment. He said, why should we be worried that Obama might be underestimating Iran? I mean, it's not like he's underestimated any other radical groups in the last year, right? In terms of making a deal. ISIS sweeps across northern Iraq, and we are watching a genocide unfold on our phones and on the internet day to day. You know, I mean, tens of thousands of people are being slaughtered, lined up, just executed. You see rows of men being marched out of the city to be executed, a mile or two long. Women being taken captive, Christians, Muslims, the Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims that are not radical enough for them. You know, the Muslims, if someone's not fully radical, they call them the munafiqeen, which means the hypocrites. You know, and so if you're a hypocrite, you're just as bad as an infidel. And they're being slaughtered, as well as this group that drew a lot of attention, the Yazidis. They're kind of this weird, dualistic, ancient religion there. The women, I mean, and they're very sweet, peaceful people, and the women were being taken by the thousands, kidnapped and just taken as slaves. Men just being slaughtered. And it gripped me because in so many ways it just felt like the beginning of things that I've seen, you know, for so long, and it's taking place. But immediately my heart leapt, and I said, Lord, when can we get there? When can we get there? Because as bloody and as terrible as this is, there's still areas that are very stable and safe. Now, those things can change overnight when everything's in flux. You don't want to just jump in the middle. But the region of, so if you see the big red splash, that's the Islamic State, and it's actually bigger now. It continues to expand, but just to the northeast you can see Erbil, and that is the city that is still quite stable. It's about 40 miles from the border of the Islamic State. They have a fairly modern airport. The city itself is quite large, and a lot of growth, and we know some missionaries there. And as all these people are fleeing, suddenly you already had refugees like crazy throughout the Middle East. You now have over 2 million displaced peoples, refugees that are living in tents, living in these little cities, spread all across that northern region, all the way up into Turkey. Now they've got them in Bulgaria, down in Jordan, and all over the place. And the one thing that I know is that the heart of the Father, it doesn't matter if they're Muslim or Yazidi or Christian, the heart of the Father is turned toward the oppressed, the broken, the afflicted, the needy, the forgotten, the crushed, the hated, the despised. These are those that He's ministering to, most particularly among His own people. But I knew that as a follower of Jesus, if Jesus is anywhere in the earth right now, He would probably be in northern Iraq. And I said, Lord, when can we get there? And so actually what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go ahead and, as I'm talking, these are not the best pictures, but these are just pictures I took on my phone when we were there. So I'll just kind of do a slideshow. And I'm hoping that it doesn't, go into my other pictures, so you'll see all like these dumb pictures of me. But I think this will just do the Iraq pictures. See if that's working. Yeah. So started talking with some friends, and we started saying, you know, networking. Who are the missionaries that we know that we can go and just basically lay hands. I just want to be with the refugees. I just want to minister. It's just doing it. This is Coca-Cola. I always, see, Coca-Cola is everywhere through the earth. Why don't we have our people like they're better missionaries than we are. But in Arabic, I always think that I always think it looks like it says Jesus. Why is it not playing? Let's see what happens here.
I think it's because you only have one photo selected.
Oh, I see. Select the whole, there you go. So we flew, there we go. So we flew into Erbil, and, oh, there's actually some videos. These are Christian kids. They were, the Christian kids were the most misbehaved. It was kind of tough. But they, so we were able to visit a Christian refugee camp, 2 Muslim refugee camps, and a Yazidi camp. This guy's name is Jamil. In Arabic it means beautiful. They're in the refugee, they're cooking, that's their oven. They would make it out of mud, and just, it's really neat. But, so we visited with the Christians. They were living in this, it was a mall that they had built that was empty, and then they built a bunch of rooms in it. Just thousands of people were living in there. And again, it got below freezing at night, so below 0 at night. And they're almost outside, It was kind of like it was like camping, but they had little kerosene heaters. You can see the camps are just made of tarps and little trailers and things. Now watch this, okay, ready? So you're visiting, and the question is, too white or not too white? It was like, oh gosh, should I wipe or not? So I had to send that out. My daughter was like, God, Daddy, wipe it, please. Some Arabic brothers. You always have to show the food. If you want to get the sense of what it's like, there's the feast laid before us. But here's the thing, I'll tell you, as we went, everyone's like, you're crazy, you're going to get beheaded, you're going to get killed. As we flew in from Germany into Erbil, a lot of the people on the plane were Christians, and you could tell. And I remember looking over and seeing a young couple, and I mean, again, everyone's looking young to me these days. This is the largest church in the northern Iraq. And he was laughing because I was telling the story of wanting to come, and I said, but I had to get my wife's permission first. And they just thought that was hilarious. Like in the Middle East, they're like, he had to get his wife. There's my, there was a young couple. They looked like they were probably 17, and they looked like they were Mennonites. She had the way they were dressed. I thought, man. And so at the baggage claim, I went over and said to the young guy, I said, are you guys Mennonites? And he said, well, actually we were Amish, but, now we are just trying to follow the teachings of Christ. And there's another one, another kid, a different kid. And I was like, if this little 17-year-old former Amish girl can go to northern Iraq to minister to the refugees, it's like, I don't feel tough at all anymore. Like anyone can do this. Like, it just blew the whole persona. But the reason that it's good to put up the pictures because you always have a picture in your head of what it's like beforehand, and you see the news. The only thing in the news is blood, death, and everything. And then you get there and it's always different. People everywhere are largely the same, And I'm not saying, everybody's the same, but you get there and you don't even have to speak the language. This lady, she spoke a little English. She let us pray for her. We just prayed for her. She just started bawling her eyes out. Just the Spirit of the Lord is present wherever people are needy and afflicted. He was our Arabic brother, the translator. And so then we went up north. This is sort of the drive up north. We went up about 15 miles close to the Iranian border. And up there's some brothers, some families that live up there, and they have a few refugee camps with they're called the Shaba Kurds, who are the Shia Kurds. It's pretty rare. Most of the Kurds are Sunni. And they had fled from the area of Mosul And then there were also some of the Yazidis, so we got to minister to both of them. And, you know, when we're sitting in a little tent with a couple of the guys, this one Shia, we're sitting with a Shia Muslim and a Sunni Muslim, and again through translators and such, he told the story of how when ISIS came in, they didn't flee right away. A lot of people didn't flee. They were killing the soldiers, but they weren't just killing everyone. But they were asking people, are you Sunni or Shia? But they would not just ask, they would ask questions. How many times do you pray a day? You know, this sort of thing. Like, so you had to know the sectarian answers, and he was lucky enough to give all the right answers, pretending to be Sunni. And so they let him live, otherwise they would just kill them right on the spot. Take the women, kill the men, take the children as slaves. And so he loaded up his car, he was getting ready to leave, and as he was driving out of town, they stopped him. And now he has everything that he owns that he wants to take in his car with his family. And they said, your keys are your son. So he handed him his keys. They got out of the car with nothing and just walked away and left. And so, you know, literally with the clothes on their back, and they walked for about 2 days, catching rides. Finally made it up to the area where we were, and sitting in a trailer that's about 10 by 10 with blankets donated from Christians and the UN and different things, and just saying, there's no work here. I mean, we don't know what we're going to do. You know, just hoping for something to happen. I mean, it's just, when someone's in that place, it doesn't matter if they're a Muslim. You say, can we just pray for you? Sure. You know, you just say, do you mind if I lay hands on you? Jesus did that, you know. They're just so open. People are so open. The one thing that I'm convinced of is that when Satan comes in like a flood, the Lord always has a response. And whenever Islam reveals its true face, when Satan comes in, you know, with both barrels blazing, it causes the human soul to reject it. And that's what's happening throughout. These are the Yazidi kids. They were so good, such good kids. And so across the Middle East right now, there are revivals breaking out in the camps. We didn't get to see any massive conversions, but there's testimonies coming in all over the place. There's a lot of limitations, frustrations with translation and things. But, you know, I mean, and the Yazidis, they were all up on a mountain called Mount Sinjar. It's a huge mountain, sort of a big plateau down in the middle. And ISIS surrounded the mountain. They were all fleeing up there on the mountain. And again, they were taking tens of thousands of people prisoner, mostly women, killing the men. And the Peshmerga, which are the Kurdish military, came in and they created a corridor, just a little corridor so that they could slip out. And so these families here had slipped out and again walked for a couple days. And the universal language right there, soccer. If you can play soccer, you can evangelize the world. Unfortunately, I cannot. Very good. But look at just the beauty of the mountains up there. You get up there in the north. It's so much more beautiful than most people realize. And so the Kurds have a saying that says the Kurds have no friends but mountains. Because the Kurds have been persecuted by the Arabs, by the Turks, by the Persians, by the Iranians. You know, they've been harassed throughout history by everyone. And so, you know, if you want to see a real good documentary, one of our friends that went with us, Dalton, some of you guys know Dalton, made basically a 1-hour documentary. What was so neat with cameras and things now is our main project there was to minister. We just brought a couple cameras along the way, you bring your phone, and 2 weeks later he has this beautiful, moving 1-hour documentary. Just stirred the hearts of people to pray and to pray in an informed way, and to be able to cry out for the people. When we look at all of the prophecies together, we look at Isaiah 19, it promises there will be a profound revival in Egypt in the last days, and also Assyria. The region, there's the Iraqi taxidermy. Look at that, that's a bear. It promises that there's going to be a revival in that area. And this was a big part of the Kurdish men. This is a big part of the reason why we went, is to say, Lord, you promise you're going to do something in this area. Now ISIS is sweeping in. let's just go up and see. Let's try to get a handle on what you promise that you're going to do. And all the things that we talked about yesterday, the coming kingdom, the peoples from the surrounding nations. There will be a massive host of people from throughout these regions. The Bible says will be coming. There's Dalton, and Steve is my main camera guy. The mountains. And this was like during the bad time of the year when they're not even pretty yet. You know, the spring hadn't even come. And we know there's going to be a profound revival in that area, and we need to be praying into it. We look at the prophecies. If we want to be prophetic intercessors, we begin with the sure word of the prophets. And he says he's going to have a harvest in that part of the world. So we know how to start praying. We know the groups to start supporting, and we can send people to go and minister and to try to bring and be part of that harvest. And the scriptures make it clear that the day that Jesus is king in Jerusalem, people will be streaming from these nations going up to worship Jesus. And so these are all pictures of the Kurds. I'm just going to end it with a little video because just Thursday before I came, I was at a conference with Iranians, Persians from the Persian world that are, let me just say this right here, these guys, let me go back to, I wonder if I can go back to that. We had a room about 15 Kurdish men, and we sat in there for about 3 hours, and they just asked questions. They were so open to the gospel. I mean, they were so, now they had all their Muslim arguments, but we were all probably a little excited. And so, you know, we had the answers, and because they spoke English, it was, is that slow motion? The iPhone has slow motion. And it was so wonderful to be able to actually talk to guys in English. And one of the guys at the end, he leaned back, and it just broke my heart, because after a few hours, he's like, so, you do believe that we are wrong? And I was like, oh, like, yes and no, you know, like, that's not my main point, but yes, you're wrong. But so, you know, I just said, listen, I think Muslims have a lot of things that are right. I think you have a lot of things that are right, but you are clearly missing the most essential elements. And some things, like Muhammad being a prophet, I don't believe that, but we love you, you know. But it was just, the openness is tremendous. But so in conclusion, this area of Kurdistan, the area of Iraq, the area that ISIS has swept through, the area of Syria, the area of Iran, the former region of the ancient Assyrian Empire, the Lord promised that He's going to have an army, a remnant of people that will be part of His kingdom, that will come from that area. And so I'm just going to end it with a brief, see if there's anything. I'll show you a couple last pictures. There's the local market. Cows feed anyone? And then here's the guy that caused me a little bit of concern because he seemed a little too enthusiastic. He was the butcher. I just didn't feel comfortable as he was sharpening his knives as I took his picture. But let's see if there's anything else. Oh, yeah, the obligatory picture in the minefield. You know, the mountains all from the Iraq, up in the mountains from the Iranian-Iraq war, just filled with mines. Here, I'll show you this guy. This is Harish. He was our main translator. As we're sharing the gospel multiple times, we had a Muslim translator. And that guy got to hear the gospel probably 100 times in a few days, you know, the days that we were there. And I'm convinced that he's this close. He's this close. He had all of his different things. But there was one point when we prayed for this Yazidi man, and then he's translating, and then the Yazidi man says, well, can I pray for you? He didn't even ask, he just started praying. And Harish turns around and says, this is not good, you guys. This is not good. He's praying some crazy stuff. He's praying crazy stuff, you know, because I don't know, they worship like a peacock god or something. I don't know what it is. And he turns, he goes, you guys don't understand. These people, they're in darkness. These people are, now here's a Muslim. He says, these people are in so much darkness. He goes, you guys need to go to Mount Sinjar and share the love of Jesus with those people, man, because they're in darkness. And I was like, wait a minute, what did you just say? A Muslim saying, you guys need to go share the love of Jesus. And so pray for Hedish. We'll pray for him in a minute. Let's pray for him right now. Father, we just pray as a room. We stand before you and we lift up this man that's receiving persecution from his own people for working with a Christian ministry. And he's heard the gospel clearly. He has the relationships. We ask that you would break in and touch his heart. Bring him to the place where he becomes one of our brothers for eternity. We believe you for it. We know you desire it. We know that you have him marked. And we thank you for that. We thank you for it, Lord, in the name of Jesus. So here was, this one's funny too. So if you know, like, hey, let's go get some chicken. So they pull it out of the cage, and they immediately would just skin it. Yeah, not skin it, but, you know, pluck it right there. And then they would just pull out a blowtorch and just cook it with the propane torch right there. And you just bought yourself a chicken. It's like, and you just pick that one. I want the cute one. And then I was like, is it done on the inside? Like, it's like a couple minutes, you know, and they just blowtorch it. But good times. So I'll just end it with this little video. And this is to remember to pray. This is just a 2-minute video. The reason I want you to see this is because these are Iranians. In the country of Iran, there is a revival breaking out. This particular network, now, I'm going to have you stop filming if that's okay. Is that all right?